Arthur Penhaligon was a man who lived in the dark. As one of the last specialist film developers in New York, his world was measured in chemical smells, the sharp sting of acetic acid and the sweet, heavy scent of silver nitrate. One rainy evening, a wooden box was left on his doorstep. Inside was a single roll of 35mm film, wrapped in a piece of dried, yellowed skin instead of paper. A note was pinned to it with a rusty needle. Develop the light that wasn't there. Arthur was a professional, but his hands shook as he took the roll into his darkroom. Under the dim safety of the red light, the film felt strangely warm, almost like it had a pulse. Probably just static electricity, he muttered, his voice sounding hollow in the cramped space. He began the process. He wound the film into the developing tank, submerged it in the chemicals, and waited. The timer ticked, a slow, rhythmic heartbeat in the dark. Tick, tick, tick. When the timer finally buzzed, Arthur pulled the film out. He hung it up to dry and held his magnifying loupe to the first frame. The image wasn't of a person or a place. It was a photograph of a hallway. But the perspective was wrong. The walls seemed to curve inward, and the shadows were darker than the film base itself. In the center of the hallway stood a tall, thin figure. It was blurred, as if it were moving at an impossible speed. Arthur moved to the next frame. The figure was closer. The next frame, closer still. By the fifth frame, the figure was standing directly in front of the camera lens. It had no face, only a smooth, white surface where features should be. But on that white surface, Arthur could see a reflection. He leaned in closer, his breath fogging the film. The reflection on the creature's face wasn't of the person holding the camera. It was a reflection of Arthur, sitting in his darkroom, looking at the film at this exact moment. Arthur froze. A cold sweat broke out across his neck. He looked around his small, red-lit room. The chemicals in the trays began to ripple, though there was no wind. Suddenly, the red light flickered and died. In the total darkness of the room, Arthur heard a sound he knew all too well. The soft, mechanical click of a camera shutter. A flash of blinding white light filled the room for a microsecond. In that flash, Arthur saw the tall, faceless figure standing in the corner of his darkroom, holding an antique camera pointed directly at his heart. The darkness of the darkroom felt different after the flash. It wasn't just an absence of light. It felt like a thick, heavy velvet pressing against Arthur's skin. He fumbled for his emergency flashlight, his fingers slipping over chemical bottles that now felt unnervingly cold. When the beam finally cut through the dark, the corner was empty. The faceless figure was gone. Just a strobe effect, Arthur whispered, his heart drumming against his ribs. Residual light on the retina. But as he looked down at his own hands in the flashlight's beam, he gasped. His skin, usually tanned from years of outdoor walking, looked pale, not just white but translucent. He could see the faint blue map of his veins, and more disturbingly, he could see the outlines of his own finger bones through the flesh. He stepped toward the developer tray. The liquid inside, a standard hydroquinone solution, had turned from clear to a deep, bruised purple. Arthur grabbed a pair of tongs and fished out a scrap of the film leader he had trimmed earlier. As he held it under the light, words began to bloom on the surface of the plastic, etched not by light, but by the chemicals themselves. The soul is the negative. The body is the print. Below the text was a signature that made Arthur's blood turn to ice. Silas Penhaligon. Grandfather? Arthur breathed. Silas Penhaligon had been a legendary spirit photographer in the 1920s who disappeared inside his own studio. The police had found his clothes, his camera, and his chemicals, but no trace of the man. The family legend said he had found a way to fix a human being into a photograph so they would never age. Arthur looked back at the film strips hanging to dry. He realized with a jolt of terror that the figure in the photos wasn't a stranger. The height, the slight stoop of the shoulders, the way the hands were held, it was Silas. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, as if a needle were being drawn through his skin. He stumbled to the sink and splashed water on his face. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't just see a pale man. He saw that his eyes were losing their pigment. His irises were turning a dull, flat gray. He was being developed. The bone light was a process of extraction. Every time the entity, his grandfather, took a photo, it pulled the density out of the living subject to reinforce its own fading image. The door to the darkroom, which had been locked from the inside, suddenly creaked open. There was no one in the hallway, but the floorboards groaned under an invisible weight. Click! Another flash. This one came from the hallway. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. He checked his arm. A patch of skin the size of a coin had turned completely gray, like a black and white photograph pasted onto a living body. Arthur didn't wait for a third flash. He grabbed a roll of film and his heavy coat, bursting out of the darkroom. He ran through his apartment and out into the New York night, but the city he knew felt different. The neon signs of Times Square seemed too bright, bleeding into the air like spilled ink on wet paper. He stopped at a rain-slicked street corner to catch his breath. As he looked down into a puddle, he saw his own reflection, but it wasn't moving with him. The reflection in the water was standing still, looking back at Arthur with those new, pigmentless gray eyes. Behind the reflection of Arthur, the faceless figure of Silas was standing in the water world, holding the camera up. Click! The flash didn't come from the sky. It erupted from a puddle. Arthur screamed as a searing heat washed over his shoulder. He ripped off his coat and looked at his reflection in a shop window. On his left shoulder, a perfect, rectangular burn had appeared. It wasn't a burn from fire. The skin had been replaced by a high-contrast, black and white image of a brick wall. He's printing the world onto me. Arthur realized, his voice trembling. He's emptying himself and filling me with the background. He realized he couldn't stay in the city. There were too many surfaces, windows, glass skyscrapers, the mirrors of passing taxis. Every reflection was a lens for Silas. Every lens was a predator. He remembered the old journals hidden in the basement of his family's estate in upstate New York, the Penhaligon Manor. His father had always told him the basement was sealed because of toxic chemical spills, but Arthur knew the truth now. It was the site of the original aperture. He jumped into his old sedan, tilting the rearview mirror toward the ceiling so he wouldn't have to see what was behind him. As he drove north, the gray patches on his skin began to itch. The photographic skin felt cold and stiff, like parchment. When he reached the outskirts of the city, the radio began to emit a strange sound. It wasn't static. It was the sound of liquid splashing, the rhythmic sloshing of film being agitated in a tank. Arthur, a voice whispered through the speakers. It sounded like the crackle of dry paper being folded. Don't move. You're blurring the shot. Suddenly, the windshield of the car began to darken. It wasn't rain or fog. The glass itself was turning into a photographic negative. The trees, the road, and the sky were flipping their colors. The sky turned white, and the trees turned a ghostly, glowing silver. Arthur slammed on the brakes just as the world outside his car became a flat, two-dimensional landscape of ink and bone light. The Penhaligon Manor stood like a skeletal sentinel against the bleached white sky. As Arthur stepped out of the car, the world felt fragile, as if the grass might snap like old film under his feet. The manor wasn't just old, it was desaturated. The ivy was a dull charcoal, and the red bricks had faded to a ghostly ash. He pushed the heavy oak doors open. The air inside smelled of dust and a suffocating amount of silver nitrate. In the grand foyer, Arthur stopped dead. Standing near the staircase were three figures: a maid holding a tray, a young boy with a hoop, and an elderly woman in a rocking chair. They weren't statues. They were living still lives. Arthur walked up to the boy. The child's skin was flat, matte gray. He was frozen mid-laugh, but his eyes, actual, wet, human eyes, moved slowly to follow Arthur. A single tear, also gray, was suspended on his cheek, unable to fall. "They're trapped in the exposure," Arthur whispered, his own gray hands trembling. A floorboard creaked above him. He looked up and saw the flashbulb silhouette of Silas at the top of the stairs. The entity didn't speak. It simply raised the camera. Click! The flash hit the grand chandelier. The crystals exploded into a rain of light that didn't fall. It stayed in the air, thousands of glowing white sparks frozen in space. Arthur scrambled toward the basement door. He knew the fixing chamber was his only hope. In photography, the fixer is the chemical that stops the film from reacting to light. Without it, the image eventually turns completely black and disappears. That was his fate, to become a black void. He threw himself down the basement stairs and slammed the lead-line door shut, bolting it with a heavy iron bar. The basement was a cathedral of glass. Rows upon rows of giant vats filled with a glowing, translucent blue liquid, the universal fixer. Arthur rushed to a vanity mirror in the corner, one of the few items not coated in silver. His face was almost gone. His nose and forehead were now a high-contrast white, and his ears were turning into dark, grainy shadows. He looked like a half-finished sketch. He checked the journals on the desk. Silas's handwriting was frantic. The light of the sun is too chaotic. Only the bone light, the light reflected off the skeleton, is pure enough to preserve a man. But the fixer requires a tether. To stop the development of the self, one must sacrifice a memory. You must drown your past to save your present. Arthur looked at the vats of blue liquid. To stop himself from turning into a photograph, he had to submerge himself in the chemical bath. But the cost was his mind. Every second he spent in the fixer would erase a piece of who he was. Outside the door, the scratching began. Not fingers on wood, but the sound of a metal stylus etching into a plate. "Open the door, Arthur," the paper-thin voice whispered. The world is so much clearer in monochrome. The lead-line door groaned as something heavy slammed against it from the other side. The iron bolt vibrated, shedding flakes of rust. Arthur knew the fixer was his only salvation, but the blue liquid in the vats looked like a freezing, bottomless ocean. One memory for 1 second of life, Arthur whispered, his voice cracking like dry film. He stepped into the vat. The liquid was thick, smelling of sea salt and ozone. As the blue chemical touched the gray, photographic patches on his legs, he felt a sensation of agonizing rewriting. It was as if 1,000 needles were pulling color back into his skin, stitch by stitch. But as the liquid reached his waist, the surface of the vat began to shimmer. Images flickered on the blue water. He saw his 5th birthday, the taste of chocolate cake, and the smell of his mother's perfume. The image grew vivid, then suddenly turned into a pale, washed-out negative before dissolving into the blue. A sharp pain stabbed his temple. He forgot the taste of the cake. He forgot his mother's name. "Keep going," he hissed, his eyes watering. He sank deeper, the liquid reaching his chest. He saw his first love, a girl in a yellow dress. He saw the day he opened his own darkroom. One by one, the images flickered and died. The fixer was eating his history to stabilize his cells. Suddenly, the lead door buckled. A long, thin, translucent hand reached through the gap, a hand made of pure, jagged light. Silas was no longer just a photographer. He was becoming the emulsion itself, a creature of liquid light trying to merge with the world. Click, click, click. The flashes were rapid fire now, strobing through the dark basement. Each flash tried to expose Arthur again, but the blue liquid acted as a shield. The light hit the surface of the vat and bounced off, unable to penetrate the chemical barrier. Arthur submerged himself completely. Under the surface, the silence was absolute. He saw the most important memory of all, the night his father told him never to come to this house. He saw his father's face, filled with a terror that Arthur finally understood. As that memory dissolved, Arthur felt his physical weight return. The translucency vanished. He was solid. He was human. But when he surfaced, gasping for air, the basement was different. Silas was standing at the edge of the vat. The entity was no longer faceless. Because Arthur had sacrificed his memories into the liquid, the archive had used that data to build a new face for Silas. The creature looked exactly like Arthur. "Thank you for the colors, grandson," the doppelganger said, its voice no longer a whisper, but a perfect, resonant echo of Arthur's own. "Now, let's see who the world remembers." Arthur climbed out of the vat, his clothes dripping with the blue fixer. He felt heavy, solidly, painfully human, but his mind felt like a library after a fire. There were shelves of empty space where his childhood and his passions used to be. He knew he was Arthur Penhaligon, but he no longer knew why that mattered. The doppelganger, the sightless entity wearing Arthur's stolen memories, stood by the basement stairs. It adjusted its collar with a fluid, confident motion that Arthur himself had lost. "You look a bit pale, Arthur," the doppelganger said, smiling with Arthur's own teeth. "A bit underdeveloped." "Give them back," Arthur croaked. His voice was raw, lacking the vibrant resonance the copy now possessed. "Those memories aren't yours to wear. The archive doesn't care about yours or mine," the copy replied, its eyes sparkling with the stolen light of Arthur's first love. "It only cares about the best print. And right now, I'm a master print. You are just the scrap paper." The copy turned and ran up the stairs with an athletic grace Arthur hadn't felt in years. Arthur scrambled after him, but his body felt sluggish, weighted down by the very fixer that had saved him. When he reached the grand foyer, the living still lives were reacting. The frozen boy with the hoop wasn't looking at Arthur anymore. He was looking at the doppelganger with a terrifying, mindless devotion. The copy was emitting a vibrance that acted like a magnet for the desaturated ghosts of the manor. Arthur burst through the front doors just in time to see his own sedan roaring down the driveway. The copy was heading back to New York City. "He's going to my studio," Arthur realized. If the copy reached the darkroom, it could use Arthur's professional equipment to multiply itself, printing Arthur's identity into newspapers, digital files, and social media, until the real Arthur became a statistical anomaly, a ghost in his own life. Arthur looked around the desolate yard. There was an old, rusted motorcycle under a tarp, his father's bike. He didn't remember how to ride it. The memory of his father teaching him had been dissolved in the vat. He stared at the handlebars. He didn't have the memory, but he had the muscle memory. His hands moved instinctively, checking the fuel and kicking the starter. The body remembered what the brain had lost. As he roared down the highway, chasing his own face through a desaturated world, the sun began to rise. But it wasn't a yellow sun. It was a harsh, white strobe. The doppelganger was exposing the world as he drove. Everywhere the sedan passed, the color was sucked out of the trees and the sky, feeding the copy's strength. Arthur pulled up alongside the car, the wind whipping his hair. He looked into the driver's side window. The copy looked at him and winked, then reached for something on the passenger's seat, the antique camera. "Smile!" the copy shouted over the roar of the engines. The highway into Manhattan had become a corridor of ghosts. As the doppelganger sped toward the city, the vibrant greens of the Hudson Valley turned into a grainy, flickering gray. The copy wasn't just stealing Arthur's life. It was developing the entire world into a flat, lifeless photograph. Arthur leaned low over the handlebars of the motorcycle, his eyes watering. He had no memories of his mother's face or his first day of school, but he remembered optics. The science of light was etched into his soul deeper than any personal history. "You're a creature of sensors and silver nitrate," Arthur yelled into the wind, though he knew the copy couldn't hear him. "And every sensor has a breaking point." The doppelganger raised the antique camera through the car window. Click! A flash of bone light hit Arthur's arm. The skin didn't turn gray this time. It turned transparent. For a second, he saw the bone of his forearm, glowing like a neon tube. The fixer in his blood fought back, the blue chemicals surging to seal the wound. But Arthur knew he couldn't take many more exposures. They crossed the George Washington Bridge. The city of New York loomed ahead, but it looked like a charcoal drawing. The skyscrapers were jagged silhouettes against a bleached white sky. Arthur saw his opening. The morning sun was hitting the glass wall of the Freedom Tower at a precise 45-degree angle. In photography, a lens flare occurs when light enters the lens at an extreme angle, scattering and washing out the entire image. If Arthur could redirect the morning sun directly into the camera's lens, he could blind the entity's connection to the physical world. He didn't pull over. He accelerated, weaving through the silent, gray traffic. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had left from the manor, a small, silver-plated film canister. He polished the silver lid against his sleeve until it shone like a mirror. As the doppelganger swerved to take the exit toward Arthur's studio, Arthur stood up on the pegs of the motorcycle. He tracked the reflection of the sun on the glass towers. He waited for the exact microsecond when the sun, the skyscraper, and the car aligned. Now, Arthur angled the silver lid. A beam of concentrated, redirected sunlight, hotter and purer than the ambient bone light, shot across the lane. It hit the doppelganger's camera lens dead center. Inside the car, a silent explosion of white light occurred. It wasn't a flash, it was a burnout. The doppelganger screamed, a sound like 1,000 sheets of paper tearing at once. The Arthur's face began to ripple and smear, the stolen memories losing their focus. The sedan swerved violently, tires screeching in a world that was slowly regaining its sound. It slammed into a concrete divider, the hood crumpling like tinfoil. Arthur skidded to a halt, his chest heaving. He ran toward the wreckage. The driver's side door was kicked open. The doppelganger crawled out, but it was no longer a perfect copy. Its face was a blur of overlapping images. Arthur at age 10, Arthur at age 30, a tree, a brick wall. It was a double exposure gone wrong. The image must be fixed. The creature gurgled, its voice a chaotic mix of frequencies. It reached for the camera, which lay on the asphalt, the lens cracked and smoking. The doppelganger didn't run like a human anymore. It moved in frames, flickering from one position to another, as if the world were a skipping film reel. Every time it moved, it left behind a trail of static, a ghosting effect that blurred the air. It scrambled toward the nearest subway entrance, heading for the heart of the city, Times Square. "No!" Arthur shouted, his voice finally regaining some of its weight. "If it hits the screens, it's over." He knew the entity's plan. Times Square was a canyon of light. Thousands of high-definition LED billboards, millions of pixels, and countless cameras. If the bone light entity could jump from the cracked lens of the antique camera into the digital network of the city, it would no longer be a single ghost. It would become a virus of image. It would be everywhere at once, on every phone, every TV, and every digital eye in New York. Arthur jumped back on the motorcycle. The city was a battlefield of color and gray. Where the doppelganger stepped, the sidewalk turned into a low-resolution photograph. Where the sun hit the fixer on Arthur's clothes, the color bled back into the world like a watercolor painting. He reached Times Square just as the doppelganger stood in the center of the red steps. The creature looked up at the massive, 30-story-high digital billboard that dominated the square. The billboard was currently showing a vibrant advertisement for a luxury watch, but as the creature raised its hand, the screen began to flicker. BZZT, BZZT. The watch on the screen began to lose its color. The vibrant blue background turned into a grainy, charcoal gray. In the center of the massive screen, a white, faceless shape began to form. The original silhouette of Silas Penhaligon. "Arthur!" the creature yelled, its voice echoing from the thousands of speakers in the square. "I am a new reality. I am the memory that never fades." Arthur looked around. He was surrounded by tourists who were staring up at the screen in confusion. They didn't realize that the light hitting their eyes was stealing their density. He saw a young woman's hand begin to turn translucent as she held up her phone to record the glitch. "Everyone, close your eyes," Arthur screamed. "Don't look at the light." But no one listened. They were captivated by the overexposure. Arthur realized he couldn't stop the screen from the outside. He had to attack the signal. He spotted a maintenance hatch near the base of the massive LED structure, the brain of the billboard. He ran for it, but the doppelganger saw him. The creature didn't move toward him. It simply gestured at a nearby security camera. Suddenly, Arthur's own image appeared on a dozen smaller screens around him. The screens became projectors. They shot beams of concentrated bone light at him, trying to pin him to the ground like a specimen on a slide. Arthur felt his legs go numb. He looked down and saw his boots were being printed into the pavement. He was becoming part of the street. "You're just a shadow, Arthur," the giant voice from the sky boomed. "And shadows belong underfoot." Arthur reached into his bag. He didn't have a camera, but he had the chemicals. He pulled out a bottle of potassium ferricyanide, a powerful bleaching agent used to reduce density in overexposed film. "If I'm a shadow," Arthur gasped, struggling against the light. "Then I'm the one who decides where the black begins." Arthur crawled toward the maintenance hatch, his body feeling as thin as a sheet of paper. Every time a digital projector hit him, another layer of his physical reality was stripped away. By the time he reached the control panel, his hands were almost invisible. Only the blue fixer stains on his palms remained solid, glowing like neon markers in the dark. He ripped open the panel. Inside lay the nervous system of Times Square, bundles of glowing fiber optic cables pulsing with the data of 1,000,000 images. "You want any digital?" Arthur spat, coughing up a fine, gray dust that used to be his lungs. "Let's see how you handle a bleach bath." In traditional photography, potassium ferricyanide is used to eat away at the silver on a print, turning black areas back into white. It is the eraser of the darkroom. Arthur uncapped the bottle and poured the corrosive liquid directly into the cooling system of the main server. Spark! Hiss! The reaction was violent. The chemical didn't just short-circuit the electronics. It reacted with the bone light signal itself. On the massive billboard outside, the image of Silas didn't disappear, it inverted. The sky on the screen turned black. The white, faceless entity turned into a deep, sucking void of shadow. Suddenly, Arthur felt a massive gravitational pull. The server rack wasn't just a machine anymore. It had become a lens. The bleach had created a negative zone in the digital signal, and because Arthur was already half developed into the light, he was sucked into the screen. He tumbled through a world of pure mathematics and static. He landed on a flat, vibrating plane of existence. He was inside the billboard. The world was two-dimensional. To his left, he saw the distorted, giant faces of the tourists in Times Square, looking in like gods through a window. To his right, the doppelganger stood, now a towering colossus of negative energy. "You've entered the frame, Arthur." The entity boomed, its voice a digital roar. "But here am the developer. I control the contrast." The doppelganger swung a hand, made a binary code. Arthur dodged, but the floor beneath him, a grid of pixels, began to dissolve. He realized that the bleach he had poured into the server was starting to work. The negative space was being erased from the inside out. "The screen is dying, Silas." Arthur shouted. "If you stay here, you'll be deleted with the rest of the signal. Then I'll take your last memory as my life raft." The entity lunged, grabbing Arthur by the throat. As they touched, Arthur felt his final, most precious memory being pulled out. The day he first saw a photograph develop a trail. The moment he fell in love with the light. As that memory began to fade, the world around them started to turn into a blinding, featureless white. The overexposure was reaching its limit. The billboard was about to burn out forever. Arthur looked at his fading hands. He had one last trick. He wasn't just a subject, he was a technician. "Every negative needs a stop bath," Arthur whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the very thing that had started this nightmare. The original 35mm film roll from Part 1. It was still coated in the fixer from the basement. Inside the digital void of the billboard, the white light was becoming absolute. The pixels were screaming, vibrating at a frequency that threatened to turn Arthur's very atoms into data. Silas, the entity wearing Arthur's stolen face, gripped him tighter, his fingers sinking into Arthur's neck like liquid ink. "I will not be erased," Silas roared, the stolen memories of Arthur's life flickering behind his eyes like a dying strobe light. "I'm the image that lasts forever." Arthur couldn't breathe, but he didn't need to. In this two-dimensional hell, he was just a series of values. He looked at the 35mm film roll in his hand, the original negative room. "You wanted to be the master print, Silas," Arthur choked out, his voice a digital glitch. "But every print needs a source, and every source needs a limit." Arthur didn't attack the entity. Instead, he slammed the film roll into the center of Silas's chest, right where the stolen heart was beating. Because the film was still saturated with the universal fixer from the basement, it acted like a black hole for the bone light. The fixer didn't just stop the development, it began to freeze the data. "What are you doing?" Silas shrieked. His edges began to sharpen, not into a human, but into a flat, unmoving image. "I'm giving you what you wanted," Arthur said, his own form beginning to dissolve into white light. Permanent préservation. A single, perfect frame. Forever. The film roll began to spin, acting as a high-speed reel. It sucked the double exposure out of the digital network and back into the physical emulsion. Silas's screams were pulled into the spiraling plastic, his face stretching and distorting until he was nothing more than a silver halide shadow on a strip of celluloid. Boom! The massive billboard in Times Square exploded in a shower of sparks and glass. The overexposure vanished. 1 hour later, the paramedics found a man lying in the middle of Times Square, surrounded by the smoking wreckage of the LED screen. He was solid, but he was silent. Arthur Penhaligon sat on the pavement, his hands resting in his lap. He looked at the crowd around him, the tourists, the police, the flashing lights of the city. He saw the colors, the yellow of the taxis, the red of the sirens, the blue of the sky. A police officer knelt beside him. "Sir, can you hear me? What's your name?" Arthur looked at the officer. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He knew how to speak, but he didn't know who was speaking. The fixer had done its job too well. He had saved the world from the bone light, but he had paid with the archive of his own soul. He didn't remember his childhood. He didn't remember his shop. He didn't even remember the faceless man he had just defeated. He looked down. Next to him, miraculously intact among the glass shards, was a single, developed strip of 35mm film. Arthur picked it up and held it against the morning sun. In the final frame of the film, he saw a man. The man was trapped behind a layer of grain, his hands pressed against the glass of the photograph. He looked exactly like Arthur, but his eyes were filled with a timeless, frozen rage. Arthur didn't feel fear. He didn't feel anything. He stood up and began to walk. He didn't know where he was going, but as he passed a shop window, he caught his reflection. He was vibrant. He was colorful. He was a high-definition human being. But as he walked away, the reflection in the window stayed behind for a fraction of a second too long, watching him with gray, pigmentless eyes. The archive of bone light was closed. But in the world of images, nothing is ever truly deleted. It's just waiting for the next developer to turn on the light.